I want to thank you all for being here today. It's just an incredible turnout. What an honor to have all of you come to this session. In fact, I think a lot of you have been coming to all of them, or most of them, and we so appreciate that. We worked so long and hard to put this series together, and it's hard to believe that this is coming to an end. The next one, of course, is our August 29th, and that's our big party. So we hope you'll all be there, that you'll invite people that you know that would like to be here for that will come. Again, once again, there is no charge. We will begin at 10 o'clock as usual with the final presentation, which will last about 1 hour, and then we're going to have a blowout barbecue. So it's our big giant welcome home party. We're going to start this morning with our Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. So if everyone please stand. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. If you all could take the flag down, thank you. I would like to know how many of you folks in this audience are Vietnam veterans. Would you raise your hands? Awesome. Thank you so much. We are so honored to have you here. How many are Vietnam veteran families that are here? How many family members? That's wonderful. Thank you so much, and thank you for your service to our country also as family members. Are there any folks here that were POWs during Vietnam? If there were, would you raise your hands? Yeah, not too many. We have a wonderful one here. They'll be talking to you about that experience. So this is going to be a very special presentation. It's really the human side of the Vietnam War that we're going to listen to today. I do want to thank our sponsors, because without these folks, when we decided to design this program, we partnered with the DoD to be one of the museums to honor the 50-year commemoration of the Vietnam War and you, the Vietnam veterans, and your families. We wanted to make it very special, and so a number of men volunteered to help me create an educational series, symposium series that would teach about the Vietnam War as a war, the tactics of the Vietnam War as they were designed and how they were implemented. And we spent over a year creating this program. And those people, if all that are here, raise your hand. Don Menger, Ted Thompson, John Sterling, Jared Van Ingen, Jack Walburn, myself, John Lane, Lance Stevenson, Heather Mullins, Jim Leonard, Major General Gary Saylor, and General Mark Schmidt. Those are the men that met on a regular basis with me and with Heather and created this incredible symposium. So I'd really like to thank them for their time. I also want to thank the sponsors. When we decided to create this symposium, we wanted it to be free. We wanted anyone that wanted to come to learn about the Vietnam War or to talk about the Vietnam War to be able to come regardless of the financial situations they might find themselves in. So we wanted this symposium to be a free event for people to come and learn. And so I started marching out through the community to raise money for this symposium, and without even blinking an eye, the following people said, we're there with you, we want to see this happen, we believe in it, and we want to honor our veterans. So the John F. Nagel Foundation, the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, the Napa Municipal Airport, my husband and I, the Riverside Hotel, KTVB Channel 7 has been incredible, Idaho Division of Veteran Services, Doug and Meredith Carnahan, Morris Dare Products Company, Idaho Power, Cloverdale Funeral Home, the Idaho Community Foundation, Lindsay Family Foundation, AgroBeef Company, Bill and Dorothy Gornick, Micron Foundation, and Price Pump Company from California. Isn't that incredible? How supported you really are by our community, truly. And I want to thank all of the Warhawk Air Museum volunteers. Please raise your hands, because these folks are why it happens. They're here setting up chairs, all of the sound systems, they clean up. I mean, without those folks, do you know that in 2014, they spent 20,000 hours in this museum? That's a lot of time to have volunteers at this museum, so they are invaluable and make this museum what it is. The Mountain Home Air Force people that are here every single session with free water, free cookies. I mean, we have the Chiefs group, the top 3, the First Sergeants Council, the Air Force Sergeants Association, the 389th Fighter Squadron. Every time they've said, we're so honored to be here. Well, we honor you and thank you so much for your service to our country. You all are wonderful. And last but certainly not least, the bathrooms. Listen, I just turned 70 and I realized how important those are. Everywhere I go, first thing I look for. So we do have 2 outside, and then we have 2 here, and we have 2 in the front wing. So just so you all know where those are, okay? And then I did tell you about the August 29th event. Please, please come. We hope AgriBeef is sponsoring that, along with, of course, all of the sponsors, but they're going to be providing all the food and cooking. And Albertsons is going to also be providing food for that. So it's free, and the last hour that we'll conduct a series here will be very, very profound. You will not want to miss it. So I'd like now to introduce Jerry Van Ingen. Where is he? Jerry is the gentleman who's going to be conducting today's series. Jerry spent 26 years in the Air Force with 150 combat missions, including 135 in Vietnam and 15 in Iraq. He flew the AC-130 gunship in Vietnam and the F-4 Wild Weasel in Iraq. He has 8,000 total flying time hours. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, 10 Air Medals, and the Vietnam Cross of Gallantry. He is so devoted to Vietnam veterans that it's heartwarming. So I'd like to introduce you. Come on up, Jerry. Thank you so much.
Good morning. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 5th Symposium on the Commemoration of the Vietnam War. Okay. I didn't think I even needed one, but oh, you're going to turn on all those lights. I'm going to have to put my glasses on here. This event is dedicated to the brave men and women who are listed as POW and MIA in that war. The goal of these symposiums was to honor, remember, and educate. I had a personal experience that kind of powered me up to get involved, and it happened in a restaurant. I can't even remember where, but the lady was serving me, a young waitress was serving me breakfast, and she put my ham and eggs down in front of me, and she said, "Here's your breakfast, but your toast is MIA." And I said, "Well, at least it isn't POW." And she looked at me like a dog watching a TV set. And I said, "You know, POW, prisoner of war, MIA, the flag that's below the American flag." And she said, "Oh." She said, "I always wondered what that POW MIA flag was." That's how well educated some of our citizens are on what happened, with the POW MIA. Okay. All right. Next slide, Barry. Over 2.7 million served in Vietnam theater of war between August 1964 and May 1975. At the end of the war in 1973, there were approximately 684 POWs in captivity and approximately 2,648 persons listed as missing in action. These numbers are approximate, as there are many who feel there's still not been an accurate, full, total accounting of the POW MIA members. As of June 15, 2015, still 1,627 persons, Americans, are still listed as missing in action from the Vietnam War. Next slide, please. The first half of our symposium today will concentrate on the plight of the POW in captivity and the burden of the family and friends on the home front. Our first speaker is retired Major Joe Krecka. Joe was born in East Orange, New Jersey in 1940. He entered the U.S. Air Force in 1964. He received his pilot wings in 1965 and was assigned to an F-4C model at Da Nang Air Force Base in August of 1966. On his 87th combat flight over North Vietnam, he was shot down and remained a prisoner of war for over 6 years. After his return to the U.S., Joe left the Air Force in 1976 and flew with Flying Tigers and then Federal Express until his retirement in 2005. Among others, he holds the Distinguished Flying Cross, 8 Air Medals, and the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry. He has over 1,800 hours of fighter time and well over 15,000 hours of heavy metal multi-engine civilian aircraft. Please roll the film.
Never give up. That's the message from a local Vietnam veteran who spent more than 6 years in captivity as a prisoner of war.
And we are honored to be sharing his story as we honor Vietnam veterans this week. Matt Lorch is here with more on his message.
Joe Krecka, who lives in North Bend, experienced the worst of the Vietnam War. His plane was shot down over enemy territory. The North Vietnamese captured him, beat him, interrogated him, and at times tortured him. Still, when he tells stories about his time in Vietnam, somehow he smiles.
This is a moment that I haven't told very, very many people.
Joe Krecka remembers every vivid detail.
There was like a flash of blue, and I felt this, I heard like a bzzz, like a buzzing sound.
Seconds later, he realized how much trouble he was truly in. But first, how Krecka got to that moment.
I had an uncle who was in the Battle of the Bulge. I had a cousin who was a bombardier in a B-26.
The family list goes on and on. For him, fighting for this country wasn't a requirement. It was a calling. In 1964, Krecka enlisted in the Air Force. His intellect landed him in the cockpit of an F-4. His sense of humor made him a standout. 2 years later, he arrived in Da Nang, Vietnam.
I thought to myself, I'm finally here. This is the war zone. This is what you've always wanted. You're here. Yeah. And I was happy.
Within 1 week, the 25-year-old learned the realities of war, flying missions at night.
And it was scary because you're flying along and you see this flash, and I thought it was gunfire. And I remember ducking, and I thought, you silly so-and-so. They got guns that are so big it'll go right through the cockpit in your head. It doesn't make any difference whether your head's down there or up here. 87 missions in 92 days. So there's not much time to do anything but fly a mission, eat, sleep, and fly another mission.
And it was during a mission to target barracks holding 10,000 enemy soldiers when a surface-to-air missile clipped Krecka's fighter jet.
The explosion sounded like boo. And all I could see was orange flames and black smoke.
His pilot, Scotty Wilson, disappeared from the front seat.
I'm sitting in the back seat of this burning airplane, so survival instincts overcame all of these feelings of glory of saving the airplane and flying it, and I went, and I'm out.
Out meant ejecting from the plane, where he spotted Scotty, who had also ejected. Scotty had been hit by another missile and was killed instantly. Below, Krecka could see North Vietnamese soldiers, hundreds of them.
I hit the ground, and they were on me just like that, and I felt this piece of metal come up next to my throat and start to go like this, and I thought, very matter-of-factly, they're going to cut my head off.
Instead, they cut off the chin strap of his helmet, then beat him relentlessly. He was now a prisoner of war.
I want my mommy. That's exactly the way I felt. Right at that moment.
The interrogations, brutal, and they included torture.
And they tossed me into a room actually that didn't have a door. They had to crawl in through a window, and I wound up right next to John Sidney McCain.
As in Senator John McCain, who despite facing brutal torture himself, offered encouragement.
The Vietnamese broke one of his arms, rebroke one of his arms when he wouldn't accept one of their offers to go home early and be a propaganda tool. And here he is encouraging me, you know, to be a stolid POW.
Kreka spent 6 years and 3 months in captivity in the camp known as the Hanoi Hilton.
I didn't think we were going to get out alive.
Please welcome Joe Kreka. Thank you.
Thank you. This is gonna take a little coordination. Laser pointer, microphone, notes. You know. First of all, in reaction to Sue's comments, going to the bathroom is overrated. First slide, Barry. What happened to the Warhawk? Don't have it? Okay. Anyways, there was a picture I had of a Warhawk, a P-40 that I thought I sent. It was a P-40 that you see out here. And that reminds me that 78 years ago, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek needed a talented person to lead the Chinese Air Force against the Japanese, and he found him in Claire Chennault, who accepted a position as colonel in the Chinese Air Force. And right at the same time, President Roosevelt was looking for a way to help the Chinese, and so he sent 100 Curtiss P-40B Warhawks that had originally been intended for Britain. Sorry, Winston. Just as important, at the same time, FDR drafted a secret executive order that was going to send pilots and maintenance personnel over to China, and that was the Flying Tigers. Then 50 years ago, in Korat, our Takli Air Base in Thailand, F-105 pilots organized to form the Red River Valley Fighter Pilots Association. And that group is still active today. In fact, they just got back from a reunion in Vegas. And right after that, the 4th Allied POW Wing was formed. The badge on my shirt is the 4th Allied POW Wing. The other stuff on my shirt is Dogwood 2, and that was my call sign when I got shot down, and an image of the F-4. With all these in common, what all these have in common is the longevity and endurance and even permanence that no one will ever forget the Flying Tigers. And if anybody thinks about the Vietnam War, they're going to think about the POWs, and that it was that air power brought an end to the war and brought the POWs home. The parallels to be drawn between the men who flew in China and the guys who flew over North Vietnam is the unbreakable bonds between men under difficult circumstances. And I salute the men that flew in World War II just like I did the guys that I flew with and served with in the Hanoi Hilton. And with that as a prologue, I arrived in Vietnam as a 25-year-old gung-ho fighter pilot. And I wish I could find Scotty. Right there is Scotty Wilson. And this is right next to the, I hesitate to call it the 480th Tactical Fighter Squadron building. It's more like a shack. Next. Now this is our shoulder patch. All fighter pilots, all pilots wear patches. And we called them, can't hardly remember what we called them. I think it was Charlie Chicken Hawk, or Charlie Chicken Hawker, or Charlie Chicken Plucker, or something that sounded like that. Next. This is the Gatling gun. This is the Su-16, and this is why they call the 366 Tactical Fighter Wing the gunfighters, because we strapped this 2,000-pound, 1,150 round of 20 millimeter draggy thing onto the belly of the airplane because we didn't have a gun, internal gun to shoot MiGs down with. And one day, was the cheapest kill of the war. We shot a MiG-17 down with 200 rounds of 20 millimeter. Next. Now there's the Gatling gun strapped on the belly of F-4C. There's the gunfighter decal. 3 MiGs that this airplane shot down. It's at the Museum of Flight in Seattle. I probably flew this airplane, but I didn't keep records, so I can't prove it. That gun will fire 100 shots a second. As fast as you can squeeze the trigger and release it, that's 25 rounds. And it doesn't sound like a gun. Sorry, ladies, but sounds more like a bull moose at his moment of triumph during the rut. Next. These are the Vietnam route packages. They had divided Vietnam into, now this is Vietnam Air War and bases. So you can see all the different bases. You can see the MiG bases up there and all the US air bases in Thailand and all up and down South Vietnam. Next. And this is the route packages. We had North Vietnam divided into route packages 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 Alpha and 6 Bravo. 6 Bravo and 4 were Navy, and 6 Alpha and 5 were Air Force, and those were the hot areas. Hanoi is right in here, and the Red River runs right through Hanoi, and anybody that flew across the Red River was eligible to be in the Red River Valley Fighter Pilots Association. Next. This is the last known picture of the airplane I was shot down in. You can see by the Gatling gun on the center line and the napalm cans on the inboards that it's going for an in-country mission. I don't know who's in the cockpit. And those big Hummers hanging on the outside are 370-gallon wing tanks. Next. These are F-4 Phantoms and F-105 Thunder Chiefs on a tanker. You know, it's one thing to see it in a picture, but to actually be there and be a part of that, it's something you never forget. Next. One of the things we had to face was enemy aircraft fire. This is the ZPU 23-4. 4 barrels of 23 millimeter, and that doesn't sound like a gun either, but unlike the Gatling gun, this one sounds like Howard Dean at the Democratic National Convention. Next. Now, here's Da Nang, where I took off from on my final combat mission. We'd headed west 280 over to Thailand, hit tanker tracks, either red anchor or blue, white anchor. Incidentally, what did they name the anchors? The anchor was, one of the anchors over here was blue anchor, and one of the anchors over there was brown anchor. Go figure. Anyways, we went up north. We went up here over like that, and then came down to our target. We didn't make it to there. Next. My front seater, Gordon Scott Wilson. He was a 1964 Air Force Academy grad. In my opinion, which I think is very highly worth it, he was the best front seater, stick and rudder man in the entire squadron, even though he was a first Louis. On November the 22nd, 1966, after only 100 days in country, and I figured out it was only after 92 days after I started flying missions, our Phantom was hit from behind by a surface-to-air missile. The SA-2 missile is about 1 foot in diameter, 25 feet long, has a 400-pound warhead, and it'll go Mach 3.5, and it'll go up to about 90,000 feet. There's no way to outrun that sucker. We called them flying telephone poles. Our airplane was on fire. We had mirrors inside the cockpit, orange flames, black smoke as far as you could see. I knew it was all over. Scotty had told me on the way up, let's not get into a panic. I said, don't worry, this thing's going to have to blow up 7 times before I jump out of it. Famous last words. He yelled very loud. He didn't need the intercom. I would have heard him anyway. He said, get out, and poof, he's gone. I remember looking up thinking, you silly SOB. He's going that way at 600 miles an hour. So I followed less than 2 seconds later and pulled the handles and ejected. And as told to me by others after I was repatriated over 6 years later, that they saw the canopy go off, they saw the seat go out, and right after that, the Phantom with 14,000 pounds of fuel, 6 750-pound bombs, and 8 air-to-air missiles exploded. If I had hesitated even 1 instant, I would have been in that airplane when it blew up. Unfortunately, and we were flying over an undercast. So they fired 1 SAM at us from behind and 1 SAM at us from another site coming from our left. Of course, we didn't know that. We didn't have any warning gear at all. So my chute opens just below the undercast, and I see Scotty, and I see the wreckage of the airplane in the ground already. I look around, and I see Scotty in his chute, but there's another SAM cloud that just went off next to him. And so right as the chute opened, the SAM went off, and then my chute opened. So after about, and his arm and his hands were not up in the risers the way they should have been. His head was hanging down and his arms were hanging down. So I figured, I hope he's just unconscious, but he's probably dead. At about 600 feet above the ground, about 10 minutes later, he's still hanging limp in the chute. I figure he's got to be dead by this time. There's a horde of Vietnamese down there. They're really anxious for me to get down on the ground. And I had my mask off. I saluted Scotty, and I said out loud, "So long, Scotty." And I imagined his name on a list of KIAs, and that a minute later, my name would be on there too. Next. That's the missile. That's the SA-2. That's a fearsome, designed against the B-52. 400 pounds of HE would level this whole block. Next. There's another picture of it. If you saw it, you could avoid it. If you didn't see it, you were dead. Next. There's Scotty's picture on the wall. His remains were returned to the United States, and he was finally laid to rest at the Air Force Academy, 22 November 1986, exactly 20 years to the day that we were shot down. I gave the eulogy to Scotty at the Air Force Academy chapel. His name is engraved in the black granite of the Vietnam Wall at panel 12E, row 110. Rest in peace, Scotty. I was captured by about 300 villagers as soon as I hit the ground. They beat me with clubs, sticks, stones. I could hear all these and feel all these blasts on my helmet. I was lying on my back as you saw it, and I felt this cold piece of something or other against my throat. But what they were doing was cutting my chin strap off. These were Vietnamese peasants. They didn't know about zippers, Velcro, snaps. You know, I'm not making fun of them. They just didn't know about this stuff. And off comes my helmet, and now the noise that I thought was loud was deafening. And now all the blows that my helmet was taking are now being taken directly on my head. In a matter of just a minute or two, they cut off my flight suit, G-suit, boots. I mean, they ruined a perfectly good pair of flying boots. They were only 3 months old, you know. All I had to do is unzip them, you know, undo the little ties, you know. Somebody could have be farming with his oxen and you know, brand new flying boots. What a waste. Anyways, as they were cutting that chin strap off, I felt this blanket of calm come over me, and medical people told me, "You were going into shock." I said, "Boy, that's good. I wish that would happen a lot more often." Anyways, they stood me up, and now all the blood came running down into my face. All I had on was my T-shirt and my shorts, and I remember what the weather is supposed to be. Wind was out of the northwest at 10 knots, and the temperature was 41 degrees. So I was freezing my butt off. Then, just like the movies, that's what I thought. This is just like the movies. An old lady came over with a bowl of rice with some meat in it and a cup of tea. And I said, geez, in survival school they tell you, take it. You may not get anything to eat for the next 3 days. But my stomach said, absolutely not. I took the tea and drank it anyway, and I almost barfed. About 5 hours later, they tossed me unceremoniously in the back of a truck and drove me down to Hanoi where the fun and games began. Next. So here's where some of the camps are around Hanoi. And it doesn't show you very much except that there are camps all around. Dog Patch is way up by the Chinese border. That's a whole story by itself. Next. This is Camp Unity. I was in Building 4. You'll see a picture of the walkway that goes along here and the wall fairly soon. I think it's next, please. No, it'll be the one after this. But this shows, just go back one, Barry. That shows you the double staggered bars. The double staggered bars here. There's no way to get through them. Next, Barry. Now this here, what you're looking at is, this is all, when the cement was wet, they put in broken bottles into the top. So it's all jagged bottles of different kinds. If you tried to crawl over that, you'd be slashed to shreds. Same thing on this 18-foot high wall. And it's hard to see in this picture, but there's electrified wires across the top, and that wall is 18 feet high. Even if you made it, you'd be slashed to hell, and boy, you'd need a lot of antibiotics. Anyway, about the torture, to all the questions that my sinister-looking interrogator asked me, I replied with name, rank, serial number, date of birth, over and over and over again. He told me, Krekka, you will die in Vietnam. I believed him. It almost happened once already that day. I was getting kind of used to the idea. Well, I couldn't divulge any military secrets. I could not tell him what the target was, because if the target had not been hit or had not been completely knocked out, we'd be sending guys back there the same way, the same day, and they'd have more guns around the target, and those guys would get shot down. Day after day, the VC kept asking me the same questions over and over again. I kept on giving them the same answers, and finally they quit asking me about my mission. Next. This is the tap code. Everybody knows shave and a haircut, 2 bits, right? He's right. This guy here is right with me. Okay. So you're going to be the ace of the base. Everybody, we realized we had to be able to communicate with each other, and communication was forbidden by the camp authorities, as they call themselves. Hold on. But the way you started a session on one side of the wall was, and the guy on the other side, if everything was okay, he'd answer with, if it wasn't safe, there was guards around or something, all you'd hear is a bump on the wall. Otherwise, you could start tapping. You tap down to the row and over to the column. So you don't go 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, and then figure out, was that AF, was that G, was it? You just go tap, tap, that's AF. Tap, 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 that's an H. So if I wanted to say hi, it'd be. And then the I would be. And I'm here to tell you I could tap as fast as anybody on the Hanoi Hill. Now you could use a series of coughs, sweeps with a broom, taps, anything. I even tapped across the room. There was a room with VC in it, and I tapped on the back wall. It went all the way across the wall to the other guys. Made a world of difference to be able to communicate, to pass policy, transmit resistance plans. Communication boosted our spirits. No man is an island. No matter what they did to try to stop us, we communicated. We even had a one-hand visual code. I couldn't do that for sour apples, but I could do the tapping. I was in solitary confinement for 8 months. After that, I was confined with other American prisoners. I spent nearly 4 years in a room with 3 other fighter pilots. That's me. And the camp commander had a big idea, a big propaganda deal where they were going to serve us Thanksgiving dinner. And so Lauren Torkelson was going to cut the head off the turkey, and North Dakota. City boy Joe, unsuspecting, 125 pounds, 22-pound turkey. I didn't realize this guy must have been a turkey on steroids, because I'm trying to hold this damn turkey down. All of a sudden, after his head's off, the turkey's out of my hands, and he's running around the yard. No head, blood spurting out. His head's over here someplace on the table, and I thought, is he getting directions? Is he telling the body, how is he staying upright, Finally, he ran out of blood hydraulic pressure and flopped over. The camp commander's going bananas, his blood veins standing out on his head. The Japanese photographers are having a good time. But anyways, next. That's the dead turkey. We had to kill another turkey. So the second turkey was very unhappy that I let the first turkey go. And you can see the SEG on my face there. Next. That's Lauren Torkelson from Crosby, North Dakota, me, Bob Abbott from Deckerville, Michigan, Jim Shively from Spokane, Washington. Jim and Lauren have both passed away. When you live together 24/7 in a small room for 3 or 4 years, you know everything about each other. Jim, Lauren, Bob became my best friends. I asked you to look around and pick 3 people of your same gender and ask, could I live in a small room for 4 years with these same guys? Brutality. Mike Christian was a Navy pilot who was shot down 24 April 67 in an A6A intruder. If it's the A model of an airplane, you never volunteer to fly the first model of the airplane. During his captivity, Mike was able to sew a small American flag together using bits and pieces. They gave us needle and thread to fix our clothes because they didn't want to give us new clothes. But Mike took advantage of that, and he got bits and pieces, and he sewed together an American flag. He hid this American flag in his clothing until one day the Vietnamese found it, and what they did with the flag, incidentally, was every day Mike would take the flag out, and all the POWs in his room would salute it and recite the Pledge of Allegiance. Well, when the VC discovered it, they dragged Mike out, beat him to within an inch of his death, and a day or 2 later, when they brought Mike back into the room, his eyes were swollen shut, he was all bloodied, his hair was all messed up, his clothes were torn. And what did Mike do when he got back into the room? First thing he did, he went back to his place where he slept, started sewing another American flag together. In the Chronicle, We Came Home by Barbara Powers Wyatt, Mike said this at the end of his entry. Perhaps the 2 strongest lessons I learned are, 1, look around and find those who love you. Be aware of their love and react to it while you still can. 2, the international communist revolution is a deadly serious business, and we must become aware of it. We need not panic, but we absolutely must deal with communism from a position of strength. Peace at any price politics will destroy us, end quote. You're right, Mike. I wonder what he would say if he was here with us today. I'll bet that he would issue us an even sterner warning than he did in 1973. He wouldn't have forgotten about communism, and he can't ignore the threat of international communism. But he'd be warning us that the biggest and most serious threats we face today don't come from outside the USA, but rather from within. And in my opinion, they come right at the top of our government. In September 1983, Mike Christian was trapped inside an apartment fire and perished. Rest in peace, Michael David Christian. Now, I had another Navy roommate, Doug Hegdell. He was a seaman apprentice, 19 years old, aboard the USS Canberra, a guided missile cruiser with 8-inch guns. And against orders, he made his way up on deck to see the guns go boom and see the big flash. And the guns went boom as he was looking over the boats going through the South China Sea. The guns are pointing that way. Doug is looking over the edge. The guns go. The ship goes sideways, but Doug doesn't. He just stays there and goes into the South China Sea. Well, he's in the water in this black, gurgling environment. He hears the screws going by like that. He doesn't even know which way is up, but miraculously he comes to the surface. And as he described it to me, to complete darkness and silence on the South China Sea. Well, that made me wonder, weren't they shooting the guns? Why didn't they keep on shooting? And I finally figured out. Somebody else up on the fire control deck said, okay, Hegdel's overboard, you can quit shooting. After treading water for 5 or 10 hours, I don't know what it was, he got picked up by a fishing boat, and he tells us fighter jocks, he said, I had the lowest, slowest ejection of the war. And I wasn't captured, I was rescued. Months later, we became cellmates, and he'd been told by the higher-ups, if you get a chance at an early release, because he was low propaganda value, being a low-ranking enlisted guy, that he should take it and take as much intelligence information home as possible. Names of camps, locations of camps, number of POWs in each camp, and most importantly, names of POWs. I tried to get him to learn the names of the POWs, and after a while, he finally agreed to learn them. And I taught him 200, I was one of the memory banks. I taught him 252 names of POWs. 2 years later, on August the 5th, 1969, he went home with 272 names, and a lot of families who didn't know what the status of their loved ones were changed from POW, from MIA to POW. Now, there are two pivotal events. I'll tell you about one just before the break and one after the break. One was the Sante raid. Next. Oops. Wasn't there a picture of a C-130? Okay. Anyways, how many people know about the Sante raid? Great. That's more than usual. 21 November 1970, Army commandos flown by Air Force pilots. The rivalry never ends. Attacked a camp 20 miles west of the capital city of Hanoi. Can you imagine this? The capital city of Hanoi and the U.S. forces are 20 miles away, landing on the ground, trying to rescue POWs. Unfortunately, the POWs had been moved. We had no way of knowing that. But the upshot of the whole thing was that conditions began to improve because they took all the people from remember that picture of all the camps around the outside of Hanoi? They brought us all back right into the center of the city in that one big building where you saw it. I said building number 4, building number 5. They held 40 or 50 guys to a room. And we had college classes. We even had a dean, Charlie Stackhouse, 6'4", 230 pounds when he got shot down. Of course, he flew an A4, which had a cockpit about this wide. And I remember flying past 4 F-4s, fly by 4 A4s. We're going back to the boat. We're going back to Da Nang. We sit in our F-4 cockpits, nice and wide and waving. And the 4 guys in the A4s are all incredible hulks, and all they can do is. So anyways, we had college classes. I learned, took math, a math course. I took Russian. I taught physics, math, classical music, and automotive theory and practice. I penned 4 books on those subjects, and we used the floor as a blackboard with a piece of roof tile that we wrestled off of an overhang to be our chalk. This is Hanoi Jane. Of all those who came to North Vietnam to give aid and comfort to the enemy, the most hated figure by the POWs was Jane Fonda. Right. She sat on this 37 millimeter gun mount. I remember seeing other pictures, she was looking through the gun sight. It wouldn't surprise me if she was looking through the gun sight as airplanes were moving by, and maybe the gun was even shooting, I don't know. So she sat on that gun mount and watched American aircraft through the gun sight. POWs who refused to meet her were tortured, and upon our return to the USA, next, this decal was one of our first attempts at an artistic rendering of our deep-seated feelings against Hanoi Jane. Talk about homecoming after the break.
Thank you, Joe. We will probably have time for questions at the end of the second presentation. If we run out of time, all four presenters will be here in the front, and we'll answer your individual questions for as long as it takes. So if you have questions for any of the presenters, you'll be able to ask them after the second session. We still need the lights out. We're not done yet. I'd like to give you a little bit of information on a couple of subjects that you probably don't know a lot about. The first one is the POW MIA flag. To be very honest, in my research of the families back home, I came up with stories as sad as the one told by Joe Krecker in captivity. It's my personal opinion that the U.S. government and military were as unprepared for this situation, the POW and MIA situation, as they were to fight the war in Vietnam. As we started to lose soldiers and airmen in the war, the military had no suitable procedures to notify next of kin of killed in action or missing in action personnel. As was depicted in the movie We Were Soldiers, the Army first notified loved ones of lost soldiers by telegrams delivered by taxicab drivers. As more and more Americans died or were lost on the battlefield, the military got a little better and more considerate of notifying next of kin, but only slowly. As airmen and naval aviators were shot down and captured by the Viet Cong, the Air Force and Navy had their own growing pains as they struggled to notify families of the shoot-downs without giving away too much information. The directions coming from the Pentagon to the families were that they should keep quiet and wait patiently so as not to give the enemy any propaganda advantage. Families were segregated, in some cases even over time asked to leave bases so as they would not alarm or scare the families of other men still flying combat missions in Vietnam. I know of one instance where a wife of a POW was turned down for a VA home loan because she needed her husband's signature on the paperwork. It took a Strom Thurmond to straighten that one out and get that lady her VA loan. It took until 1969 for the wives and the families of the POWs to finally organize into a cohesive group called the POW National League of Families. They organized around Air Force bases and naval stations and brought their story to anyone who would listen. A letter-writing campaign to newspapers, congressmen, senators, and even the president established this group as the voice of concern and the platform for educating the United States citizens to the plight and suffering and ill treatment of POWs in North Vietnam. The result of these efforts lessened the ill treatment of the POWs in the long run and helped the families acquire much needed information about their loved ones in captivity. In 1970, Mrs. Michael Hoff, a POW wife, recognized the need for a symbol for the POW MIA awareness movement. She contacted a man named Norman Revkees to design a flag that would represent our missing men. After approval by the board of the National League of Families, the flag was manufactured and distributed so that there could be the best dissemination of the flag. No trademark has ever been registered and no profits from the flag go to the League of Families. On March 9, 1989, the official POW MIA flag that flew over the White House was installed in the Capitol Rotunda. Other than Old Glory, it is the only flag to ever be flown over the White House. Today, the POW MIA flag flies over a plethora of military and civilian locations to demonstrate America's determination to account for all U.S. personnel still missing from all wars. Next slide, please. Another interesting and unique story of the Vietnam POW MIA era was, of course, the POW MIA bracelet. How many people here had a POW MIA bracelet? The idea for the bracelet came ironically from two young California college women who were looking for ways that college students could be involved in positive programs to support U.S. soldiers in Vietnam without becoming embroiled in the controversy of the war itself. Kay Hunter and Carol Bates got the idea from a TV personality named Bob Dorman, who had gotten a bracelet from a Vietnamese hill tribesman and wore it to remind him of the suffering the war had brought to so many. The girls started looking into ways to fund them and make POW bracelets to heighten the awareness of the program. They were turned down by the likes of Ross Perot, Howard Hughes, and many others before their adult student advisor, Gloria Chopin, convinced her husband to loan them $10,000 to make the first 1,200 bracelets. While the brass bracelets cost 75 cents to make, they thought they needed to keep the selling price low so that a student could afford to buy one. At the time, the cost of a movie ticket was $2.50, and they concluded that a student would give up one movie to support their cause. More expensive copper bracelets for older people were priced at $3. The girls attended the annual National League of Families meeting in September of 1970 and stole their idea to the families of the POWs. On Veterans Day, November 11, 1970, they held a news conference to kick off the bracelet program in California. Public response was immediate, and in a short time, the girls were taking orders for over 12,000 bracelets a day. In all, this group manufactured and distributed more than 5 million POW bracelets. The money from their proceeds were used to publicize the POW MIA issue using brochures, bumper stickers, buttons, and advertising. The group responsible for this amazing idea did not profit from their efforts, and the highest paid member of the group was paid $15,000 per year. Less than 20% of the proceeds went to the overhead expenses. In 1976, the group closed its doors. By then, the American public was tired of hearing about the Vietnam War and showed very little interest in the POW MIA situation. Next slide, please. As my previous slide showed, there are still 1,627 Americans listed as missing in action from the Vietnam War. The U.S. government has worked in concert with Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and even China to recover any and all remains of those missing in action. There are many who feel the government and the military have not done enough and plead with all of you to make your elected officials aware of funding requirements to aid in this long and painstaking effort. The good news is that MIAs from World War II, Korea, and Vietnam are still being recovered, and the efforts are ongoing. There are still thousands of family members who do not have a final closure on their loved one. This is an emotional and a controversial part of our history. The good news is that the money so far is still being authorized by Congress to continue to recover the remains of men from all wars. Roll the film, Barry.
Komok noi lin mai. Ndakova.
Barbara Riley?
Yes?
Ma'am, it's about your husband. Something's been recovered. We verified the identification tags for authenticity, and I assume you can speak to the validity of the ring.
I knew the moment I saw it. We had it engraved on our first anniversary. With you forever. Was there anything else?
Ma'am, that's all the fisherman and his son found. But they did give us a location, which means the excavation team knows where to begin the search.
Bless their hearts.
Barbara, this is just a first step, but we're going to do everything we can to find him.
Bring him home. I'm with you, my love.
Forever.
Our next guest speaker has his roots in the Treasure Valley and will describe what it was like on the home front. He had an absentee father who was listed as missing in action during the Vietnam War. Lance Stephenson's career spans 28 years in human and veterinary pharmaceutical sales as a product and sales manager. Lance is a founding member of the Boise Valley POW MIA Corporation. He was the director for 4 years and is currently their senior advisor. He is the Idaho State Coordinator for the National League of POW MIA Families in Washington, D.C., and has been a member since the early 1970s. Lance's father, Colonel Mark Stephenson, was shot down over North Vietnam April 29, 1967, and listed as missing in action. 21 years later, his father's remains were repatriated due to the efforts of the National League of POW MIA Families. Lance started Honor Flight of Idaho in March 2011 and is its director. He makes the arrangements to take World War II veterans from Idaho, ranging in ages from 86 to 100 and over, to Washington, D.C., so they can see the memorials dedicated to their service and sacrifice. He has received many awards for his continued efforts in the veteran community in Idaho, including the State of Idaho Spirit of Freedom Award and the Governor's Brightest Star Award. Please welcome Lance Stephenson.
Thank you, Colonel. You know, it's pretty hard to watch. So I got to catch my breath sometimes because that's always been a part of my life. You know, I wanted Jerry to introduce me the way he did because I got to tell you guys a story that I think you Vietnam veterans would appreciate. I was in pharmaceutical sales pretty much my whole career, 28 years. And my mom had moved to Denver and had taken on a new job. And they had brought her in for the morning meeting so that everybody could get introduced to her and they could find out a little bit about her, see who she was, you know, where she came from. And they asked her about her background and if she had kids. And the joke in our family is she had 4 kids, none of them lived. So she told them that she had 2 daughters and 2 sons. One of her daughters is a teacher, my sister Chris. The other worked for the Red Cross, my sister Kyler. My brother Mark is the eldest. He worked for the state of Idaho for most of his career and currently works for Homeland Security. And her son Lance sold drugs to vets. And she said the room went quiet, and somebody said, "Vietnam vets?" Oh, come on.
So when she said that, then nobody had, after that, anytime I went into her office, I got winks, I got money under the table, and I said, the drugs that I sell are going to make you scratch on a fence post or rub on the carpet. You don't want them. We'll go first slide, please. Let's give it up for Barry for the great job he does getting these slides going. So you can see this is, I think, a beautiful portrait. And up above, I know you can't read that, it says, alone, unarmed, and unafraid. Now, Major Crockett just talked about a fighter, an F-4 fighter. My dad flew an RF-4C, unarmed photo reconnaissance aircraft. The only armament on that plane was 2 38 specials, one in my dad and one in Gary Sigler, the backseater. It's kind of hard to shoot a 38 special out of the cockpit of that at 400 plus knots or 500 knots, whatever they happen to be running. Next slide, please. This is our family. We had just got back from from Japan. Dad was stationed at Misawa. This is my brother Mark on the left. I'm the bruiser on my dad's knee with the bottle in his mouth. I guess probably most of my life I've had a bottle in my mouth. And then my mom, her name is Vicky. Slide, please. I was about 1 year old. This is my father. At this time, he was captain, and he's standing on the side of an RF-101. He was about 29 years old, I believe my mom said. Next slide, please. Let's try, can we go one forward, Barry, and see if we got, this is the slide I wanted. This is the RF-101, called the Voodoo. My dad flew these in Vietnam, flying out of Tan Son Nhut. I want you to pay attention to the dates. They started in January of 1961, and he flew there until December of 1962 when they were removed from Tan Son Nhut. They were pulled in and out of country because of the American people and the fact that we were not in a war and we didn't want to get any more involved. So they actually flew to Tan Son Nhut from Okinawa, and they would stay there until people got wind that they were there. They were flying with the South Vietnamese Air Force. And my dad held the record for a good part of a year for having the most bullet holes in an unarmored airplane. 58 to be exact. The guy that took it over from, took that position over from him got the whole tail section blown off and was still able to land. So it was a pretty heavy-duty airplane. It was just built for speed. You know, one thing, if you don't have anything to shoot with, you got to be able to go faster than everybody. And slide, please. Let's go back one before where the group was standing by the F-4. There you go. We spent a few years at Maxwell Air Force Base. Dad was the base operations officer there. And he decided that as the 101 was being phased out, that the next step up would be the F-4 as they turned all the photo reconnaissance to the RF-4. And so he went to school at Shaw Air Force Base, and this is the day that he graduated. And right here, this is him next to the tall guy. And this is Gary Sigler, his backseater. They had been flying together in the for quite some time and trained together in the F-4. And Gary was with him the entire time he flew the F-4. He graduated in June of 1966 and was immediately sent to Vietnam November 1966. We had since moved to Mountain Home Air Force Base, so when the wing went over, the squadron went over, we were at Mountain Home, and he left almost immediately. We barely got here into town, and having lived overseas and in Montgomery, Alabama, where the grass is so green, even the rocks grow, we moved out here to Mountain Home, and we were wondering who Dad pissed off. And my brother mentioned that, and he wasn't real happy about that, but I remember thinking that, you know, there's a lot better places than dirt to live. So, but that's when he graduated. Now, the first time I saw an F4, I was 9 years old, and the F4 was at Shaw, and Dad had taken me out to have a look at it. And the first thing I saw is it had a flat tire. And it just gave me a weird sensation that I don't think I've ever had before. I just said, I don't like that airplane, Dad. It has a flat tire. And he said, it'll be all right. They'll fix it. So slide, please. And one more. This is the group, Bravo Reconnaissance Task Force, Flight B, that was flying out of Tan Son Nhut over Vietnam on a daily basis. And what were they doing? They're getting troop buildups, where the enemy was, where we needed to be, and giving that information back. I mean, this is way before satellites and things like that were being used. Slide. This is the 11th TRS at Udor in Thailand. Dad is not in this picture. He was out flying that day. Another omen. Some of the guys in this, and I want to see if he's here today. Is Doug Pennington in the crowd? Doug, are you here? This is Doug Pennington right here. He was at our last, he's been at most of our last ones. Doug was my dad's roommate. An additional roommate here was Major Speed Sprague. And there's one more gentleman I want to show you. The guy leaning right here on the wing of this F4 is Captain Jerry Dwyer. Just remember those names. It's going to be a test. Okay, that picture was taken in early 1967 at Udor, and like I said, slide please. This is an actual picture of my dad flying this F4 outbound from a target, and they met up with another RF-4C on the way back to Udorn. So he shot this picture. Slide, please. And this one as well. So my dad's flying, the pilot, and Gary Sigler is the navigator in the back. Gary told me that that picture was seen through most parts of the country across the U.S. On the front page cover of some news story that was running, and they kind of liked that they got on there. They didn't know it until they saw newspapers when they got back. And slide, please. This picture was taken April of 1967. It was the last picture ever taken of my father that he had put it in the last letter that he sent to my mom. He was shot down April 29th, 1967, and was listed as missing in action for 21 years. He was 36 years old, kind of an old guy for Vietnam standards. At 8:30 p.m., or I'm sorry, 8:30 a.m., Sunday, April 29th, 1967, a blue staff car pulled up in front of our house at Mountain Home Air Force Base, and the base commander, the head of chaplains, and a head nurse from the hospital there got out. My brother Mark went upstairs to tell my mom that they were there. Mom was coming down the stairs when Colonel Owens, the wing commander, base commander, I should say, met her at the bottom of the stairs, and I heard my mom say, "Please, just let him be missing." I was 10 years old. My dad was on his 94th mission. He would have been on his way home, most likely in the next few weeks. But as you know, that didn't happen. It took 21 years to get him home. We're going to take a break at this point, so please stay tuned. I got more to my story. Thank you.
We're going to start with a 9-minute film. This film was made right after Operation Homecoming. And for those of you who don't know what Operation Homecoming is, Operation Homecoming was the return of all the POWs in February of 1973. It very close and dear to my heart because my sister was a flight nurse, and hauled 2 loads of POWs out of Hanoi, and then numerous loads out of Clark back to Travis, where she was stationed. She would be here to speak. Unfortunately, she passed away 2 years ago. But without further ado, we'll run the film and start our second session. There's been numerous requests for a Q&A afterwards, and so we're going to try to work that in, and we'll have a roving mic and handle Q&A at the end of the session. For those who don't want to stay for the Q&A, I would request that you just get up and quietly leave so that we can continue on with the Q&A. So roll the film.
The first group of American prisoners released under the Vietnam Peace Agreement have now had a day to enjoy the emotions of freedom. They've had an opportunity to call home, to sleep in good beds, and to eat the kind of dinners never known in the communist prisons of North Vietnam. And American doctors at the Philippines Clark Air Force Base have had the time to give them at least preliminary checkups. They report that most of the 143 men are in relatively good physical condition. The expectations are that many will be leaving for the United States later this week for recuperation at military bases near relatives. Most of the prisoners, 116, left their captivity in Hanoi after generally smooth formalities. ABC's Lem Tucker narrates this report from there.
The advance party of Americans had been on the ground in Hanoi several hours, meeting with North Vietnamese officials, making sure that all the final details of the release were worked out. Details completed, the first evacuation plane was loaded. As prearranged, the first aboard were those physically unable to walk. Then the rest. At last, the moment many of these men must have thought would never come. Liftoff. On board, even though the sound of the occasion was not made available to us, the pictures were more than enough to show how the men felt. Included in this first group was the longest-held prisoner, Navy Lieutenant Commander Everett Alvarez of Santa Clara, California, shot down in August of 1964. And with that plane just a few miles out of Hanoi, the second group was boarding. Most of them appeared to be rather reserved in mood until they were sure it was for real. And again, the pictures told the story. We are told that the 2.5-hour flight to Clark was filled with coffee drinking, smoking. One officer said the men cleaned them out of American cigarettes, and they asked questions. Questions about fashions back home, about women's liberation, about their rank. One man walked by a nurse and said, "Wow, smell that perfume." They even brought back a mascot. Some of the men were reported to have said they couldn't believe they were free. But finally, with the landing at Clark, it was true. Lem Tucker, ABC News.
Clark Air Base has been ready for days and waiting expectantly. When the first C-141 hove into view from Hanoi, shivers ran up and down spines. Officials had discouraged large crowds on the flight line for fear of upsetting the POWs. As it turned out, they needn't have worried. Navy Captain Jeremiah Denton spoke on behalf of his fellow prisoners in the first plane.
We are honored to have the opportunity to serve our country under difficult circumstances. We are profoundly grateful to our Commander-in-Chief and to our nation for this day. God bless America. God bless America.
The second man off the first plane was Everett Alvarez, Jr., the American longest-held prisoner in North Vietnam, 8.5 years. Here, as the men stepped down to a simple welcome from the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific, they were, for the most part, beaming with joy, waving, and sometimes even recognizing friends in the waiting ranks of military. Here at Clark, Operation Homecoming has gone so far without a hitch. 40 men from the first plane were whisked away to the base hospital for the first steps in their rehabilitation. Their welcome along the short route to the hospital was tumultuous. doctors here are already voicing their encouragement at the men's physical condition. They're hopeful that it will not be long before they can move on from the Philippines to the United States and their families. As the second C-141 touched down, the first group was settling easily into hospital life. They chose roommates. They asked dozens of questions about what was happening in the world, and they began to make those first important phone calls home. While they did, Air Force Colonel Robinson Reisner spoke for the second group of men to arrive.
It's almost too wonderful to express, on behalf of all of the other men who have been prisoners, I would like to thank you all, and our President, and the American people, for bringing us home to freedom again. Thank you ever so much.
It was after dark when the hospital plane bringing the prisoners, military and civilians, arrived from South Vietnam. It had been a long and frustrating day for them, not to mention their imprisonment by the Viet Cong. To us, none of them looked as well as the men who'd earlier arrived from the north. They, too, received the same dignified and genuinely loving attention from the people at Clark. At the end of the day, word came from the base hospital that the men were in an ebullient mood. Some of them in the lineup for dinner had eaten ice cream even before they devoured steak, corn on the cob, chicken, and strawberry shortcake. And finally, by a special request, they were given a television showing of their own arrival here at Clark. Peter Jennings, ABC News at Clark Air Base in the Philippines.
At this time, we'll have Joe Krecka come back and tell us a little about his personal homecoming experience.
Thank you. I should have been happy, right? We were told, don't smile. Don't let the photographer see you smiling. So I put on my best scowl. Evidently, it worked. This is sitting outside the bus at GLM Airport just before we boarded. Remember I told you I was going to tell you about two pivotal events. First was the Sante Raid. The second one was Operation Linebacker 2. But I just thought of something. On that last film, they were talking about having good meals when you came back. I got invited to three different friends of mine invited me over to have dinner, and guess what they served me? Chicken with rice. While we're on the subject of food, in 1967, they gave us this new thing in a dish. It was orange, and I thought, wow, sweet potatoes, and it was seasoned and it tasted good, you know. And the next day it didn't have much of a seasoning in it, and the next day I realized I was eating pumpkin. 121 days in a row, 242 meals in a row, pumpkin. Do not offer me any pumpkin in any form. Pumpkin pie, pumpkin ice cream, pumpkin muffins. You'll get the same treatment. Now, in late 1972, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong representatives walked away from the ongoing peace conferences in Paris. In order to bring them back to the table, President Richard Nixon, my personal hero, and despite opposition by his so-called advisors, ordered the start of Operation Linebacker 2. How many know about Operation Linebacker 2? Don't lie. Okay, that's pretty good. Operation Linebacker 2 was when President Richard Nixon sent the B-52s to hit Hanoi and Haiphong, and the bombing started on December the 18th, 1972, and continued for 11 days, except for a unilateral stoppage of the bombing from Christmas Eve to Christmas Day for 36 hours. Despite that, what did the mainstream media call the bombings? The Christmas bombings. Go figure. Anyways, the peace accords after that, I mean, when that happened, the Vietnamese came back to the peace conference in a more favorable mind to negotiate. And by January the 27th, the peace accord was signed, and then the POWs were supposed to come home by order of shoot down, with the sick and wounded coming first. Had it not been for the determination of President Nixon and the bravery and sacrifices of the tactical air crews, especially the B-52 crews, the POWs might never have returned. It would have been the same result if George McGovern had been elected. On February the 12th, 1973, the first group of POWs left Wallow Prison to get on buses to Hanoi's at Hanoi's GLM airport that fly to Clark Air Base in the Philippines. When I boarded the C-141, I saw the American flag on the vertical stabilizer. What a sight that was. But I didn't allow myself to relax and really feel that I was free until we were 30 miles off the coast of North Vietnam and outside the range of the surface-to-air missiles. So this is my group of 20 lined up outside the bus. Next. Isn't there another picture in there? Was there a picture of me saluting Colonel Abel? Anyways, that's Charlie Plum. One man came up to me, man with a red shirt. There he is. There's Charlie. I'm sitting next to him on the 141. The feelings aboard that Air Force transport approached what I called hysterical happiness. Loud cheers went up when the pilots pushed the throttles up to takeoff thrust and the engines roared, and then again when the airplane rotated and lifted away from the runway. Those moments you never forget. They're called significant emotional events. Next. This is on the bus at Clark, and these are New Jerseyans, I'm proud to say. There's Joe Milligan. There's yours truly, and I think that's John Davies. But anyways, how they managed to get 3 New Jerseyans on the bus at Clark, I don't know. We're famous all over the world, you know, mostly for chains and street fights. Next. Here I am getting off the airplane at Newark, sorry, and you can read the caption. It has a date wrong. I was shot down November the 22nd. But when I got home, my street was Ampere Parkway. The street was completely clogged. There was no traffic. It was like maybe 1,000 or 1,500 people there. Next. 3's in patch. See, there's lead, 2, 3, and 4. When you lost a guy, a 4-ship out of a 4-ship, when the airplanes came back, they would come back with, no matter who got shot down, they'd leave the number 3 slot open, and people on the ground could see somebody got shot down. And the 3's in patch was developed to signify that guy is now back in formation. And so that's Operation Homecoming. God bless America. Next. Now, these guys are former POWs. I don't want to say anything nasty about my comrades in arms. I mean, they said all that wonderful stuff about enduring friendships and all that stuff. But these guys spent perfectly good vacation money to go see the outside of the Hanoi Hilton. I wasn't in that group. You know, happiness, they said, is having a doorknob on the inside of your door, you know, but because we didn't have those. Now, people always ask me, what kept me going while I was a POW? Just like a table that needs 4 legs to keep it upright and steady, there were 4 pillars: faith in God, faith in country, faith in family, and faith in self. But no matter how no matter how bad things got, you had to have a sense of humor. That was a fifth pillar. That was like the center post in a tent. No matter how bad things got, if you could find something to laugh about, you could make everything go more smoothly. One crazy guy named Ray Herenick told the Vietnamese one day, he says, "We're having a national day coming up." The Vietnamese never thought to ask what national day. National day was the term they used for holiday. And he said, "Can we have some cookies?" And so they brought the cookies in and stuff like that. After he got the cookies and started the distribution process in the room, they asked him, what national day is it? He said, "Cambodian Independence Day." That laugh was at their expense. Let me tell you about determination. I'll give you a quote and see if anybody knows who said this. Quote, "Nothing in the world can take the place of persistence. Talent will not. Nothing is more common than unsuccessful men with talent. Genius will not. Unrewarded genius is almost a proverb. Education will not. The world is full of educated derelicts. Persistence and determination alone are omnipotent. The slogan, 'Press on,' has solved and always will solve the problems of the human race." Calvin Coolidge, President of the United States. That's why the communists could never beat us, never. They could kill us, but they'd never beat us. I spent 6 years and 3 months in the Hanoi Hilton, and I'll never forget the friendships that were forged there under the most difficult of circumstances. Press on. God bless America. Thank you all for your attention, and thank you, Barry, for your help.
Thank you, Joe. Joe traveled here all the way from the Seattle area to give this presentation, and we certainly appreciate your time. Our next speaker is Doris Worster, retired Lieutenant Colonel, United States Air Force. Doris was born and raised in California and graduated from St. Luke's Hospital School of Nursing in San Francisco, California in 1965. She immediately joined the Army and served in Vietnam in 1968 as an intensive care nurse at the 91st Evac Hospital at Tuy Hoa, and then the 27th Surgical Hospital at Chu Lai, providing the greatest experience of her career. After her return to the United States and 2 years of civilian life, to get over her experiences in the Army, she realized the error of her way and joined the United States Air Force. In 1972, she was assigned to the 9th Air Force Evac Squadron at Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines as a flight nurse in the C-9 Nightingale. In 1988, she retired from active duty. In February of 1973, Doris augmented C-141 medical evacuation crews in the return of the POWs from Hanoi, and she's here to tell us her story. Please welcome Doris Worster.
Thank you, Jerry, and thank all of you for having me, for all the nurses that were there. But I had to say, he says, you know, I saw the light and got into the Air Force, but I have to say, I love the Army, and the Army taught me humility. Yes, I think I saw the first and the last, and I hope the last of the Vietnam War. I was there in January of '68 for the Tet Offensive. That was my second day working, and I thought, oh my God, the whole year is going to be like this. I hope I'm strong. But coming back to the Air Force, after a year at Andrews, I came to the 9th Aerovac. We flew all over Southeast Asia, but the end of the war came. And we stood alert for 3 months, And then they said when the POWs were finally going to be released, they said, C9's too small. We can't use you. We'll bring the 10th Aerovac unit out of Travis. So we're there at Clark, and the world is passing us by. But then our commander was very strong and said, our people can augment your crews. So we got to augment them, and we did get to Hanoi. I went in on the next to the last day, and Joe showed you the ones that came out first. I have to say, our patients were in better condition because they'd only been there a year. But I don't know about you, but I don't think I'd do well being held hostage for a year. But these men were wonderful. The Aerovac Squadron, our objective was to try to know as much as we could about the patients to begin with, and go in and essentially with the crew, we were had the regular Aerovac crew, which is usually 2 nurses and 3 med techs. We were augmented by the escort officers and the residents in aerospace medicine, and those were the medical doctors that were there should their expertise be needed for the patients. Operation Homecoming, March of 1973. Clark was, I think everybody in the world was at Clark Air Base, especially everybody that belonged to any news organization. They were everywhere. But it was a wonderful time. We went in, we brought the POWs out. After we were told to begin with, we'd had several briefings, what we were going to have, and supposedly we were told the POWs, they wouldn't know how to act right. They'd been held hostage too long. They wouldn't know how to sit in a chair. They wouldn't be able to eat. Well, I think starting in 70, probably things changed a little bit, and they were treated a little bit better, and at least got some pumpkin and rice. So we went in, and it was we first flew out of Clark to Da Nang, because we were the second plane of the day. The first plane flew directly to Hanoi. They landed. They waited until the patients were released, and came out. And as soon as they took off, then our plane left Da Nang. We'd been circling. We'd taken off and circled a little bit, and then we headed straight to Hanoi. We got there, and it was just like a kid at Disneyland, but it was a different situation. You look around, and there was a big Aeroflot plane there. The Russians were there, and they wanted to see what these American medical people looked like. So they got in a little van, and they drove up and down, staring at us and taking our pictures. Okay, but finally the buses came, bringing the POWs. They stopped by the hangar out in front of everybody, and as they got off, they were lined up, as you saw in the pictures. Oh, this is me. I'm the only female, so I don't think you really need the laser. But this is, we had to stay right at the plane. We were not allowed to take any cameras. We were not allowed to wander around. We had to stay right by the plane. As the, in the back there was a table where the people that signed all the paperwork sat, and as the POWs came up, they were met by their escort officer, and they then came out to the plane, and we hugged and just till everybody was on, everybody was settled. We closed up. then we went home. And that was the good thing. I don't think not many people sat. That was the thing. Everybody just wanted to stand. They couldn't believe it because they had been put through quite a bit. You know, a lot of times being told they were going to be released, and they weren't. They smoked. They didn't have any problem eating, but we didn't have any takers on the insure that we carried because people were not, they were going to be in such bad condition and their digestive system was going to be so bad, all they could eat was insure. Nobody took us up on insure. So, anyway. Did you? No, I didn't think so. Anyway, we landed at Clark. All of our patients were able to walk off, all of the POWs. And I think that's it. As you saw, which shows. Then they got on the buses to go to the hospital, and the 9th Aerovac was out of it. We didn't get to see them again. They were pretty much sequestered at the hospital. From there, they did get to go out, usually after hours, or they'd close the BX, they'd close whatever. If those POWs wanted to go someplace, they'd close it to everybody, and they got to go. Thank you.
Thank you, Doris. Doris flew out here from Colorado. She resides in Pennsylvania in the winter. I can't imagine why. But anyway, and then she goes to the mountains of Colorado for the summer, and she agreed to come out here to tell her story. Once the POWs got to Clark and then on to the United States, our government felt that they were a huge intelligence wealth of information, and so they were assigned debriefers to record everything they could record about their experience for posterity and for use in training, in POW resistance training in the future, and any other thing, and also overtly to find out if any of the POWs had acted in an unmilitary professional way to where they would have to be court-martialed or anything like that. They wanted the full story. Our next speaker, Donald Menger, First Sergeant, U.S. Army, retired, was one of those debriefers. Don Menger enlisted in the U.S. Army in May of 1964. During his Army career, Don was assigned military intelligence duties in numerous foreign countries, to include the Republic of Panama, Vietnam, the Netherlands, Germany, Grenada, and South Korea, along with numerous assignments in the United States. His military awards include the Bronze Star, the Legion of Merit, the Meritorious Service Medal, and the Vietnamese Service Medal. First Sergeant Menger retired from the United States Army after 26 years of service in 1990. He then went on to complete a 21-year career with the Drug Enforcement Administration as an intelligence research specialist. Don is now fully retired and does volunteer work at numerous locations, to include the Warhawk Museum. He comes to us today to describe his work as an intelligence debriefer of the POWs. I thought it was at Clark Air Force Base, but apparently it was in the States, right? Is that right, Don? When they returned home from Hanoi. So please welcome Don Menger.
First slide, please. How many of you remember that? How many of you remember this picture on the TV screen? This is the Commander's Digest. This is the first time the POWs list was published here in the United States and out to the world. We knew about who we were going to talk to about 2 months, maybe 3 months before we saw our POWs. Chief Regis, CW2 Morris Regis, and I had one POW we'd learned all about, only to find out he was MIA. Next slide, please. We then learned about our next POW. Bob Lewis, Robert Lewis III. This was taken off of the internet. The list that's published in the Commander's Digest was way too small for you all to see on the screen. So I pulled this one off of the internet so that you could see the lists that were made. There was only one POW, one individual I know who was not on the list. Robert Garwood. You Marines know especially who Bob Garwood was. He'd gone AWOL and was the subject of an intense search in Vietnam. He later came out after the war. He was helping the NVA. The most important mission we intelligence types had in Vietnam was the location of our POWs. There were a lot of people who said that Bo Bergdahl was forgotten about. We didn't know where he was. We didn't care. I'm here to tell you that was all BS. To this day, the most important mission in the Department of Defense is the location of all of our POWs and MIAs. That was our #1 mission in Nam also, no matter who we were assigned to or what we did. I was assigned to the 702nd Military Intelligence Detachment. We were assigned directly to U.S. Army Vietnam headquarters. We had offices from Hue all the way south into the Delta. I was at Cam Ranh Bay and at Long Binh, where I worked out of, to various and sundry sites doing what I had to do for a living. How were we debriefers chosen to do our job? We were all Vietnam in-country counterintelligence agents. You had to have been in Vietnam as a counterintelligence agent to be chosen as a debriefer for the POWs. Then CW2, Morris Regis, and I, and by the way, I was a staff sergeant when I went to Vietnam. We heard a lot of stories from all the officers, but we enlisted, did our share in Vietnam also, as you guys well know. I was a staff sergeant in Vietnam. I came into the Army before Vietnam. So I did my part also. Our training. What did we do for training? Next slide, please, Barry. I pulled this picture off of Amazon. It's a book. It's the cover of a book called 5 Years to Freedom, written by then First Lieutenant James Nicholas Rowe. First Lieutenant Nick Rowe was a Special Forces officer in the Delta when he was captured by the VC. The Army kept looking for him. Finally, they got wind of where he was. And I have a first-hand account, second-hand account of how he was rescued, because I went to school with a gentleman who was a warrant officer at the time, and he was the case officer in charge of finding Nick Rowe and pulling him out. Through Army intelligence efforts and the part of the Army Special Forces in Vietnam, the day came when Nick was able to charge out of the jungle, leap into and get pulled into a Huey helicopter and extracted out of the Delta back to freedom. Nick later wrote this book. This is not the cover of the book that I read and that Chief Regis read and every one of us read. This is how we began to learn about the conditions our POWs were in and lived under. We also did various studies or learned various studies of something called the Stockholm Syndrome. Stockholm Syndrome was out of Stockholm, Sweden, where a bunch of hostages began to identify with their captors. We learned about this phenomenon because of the POWs in Vietnam were so long in captivity, there was a possibility of their beginning to identify with and sympathize with their captors. We learned what not to say and what to say, how to ask questions of our POWs, our returnees. Our main focus was to let the POWs tell their story. We were the beginnings of what you would call today psychological counselors. We learned from Korea, somewhat from World War II, but mainly from Korea, that our POWs needed to tell their story to decompress, to begin to come back to a full and prosperous life, not only physically but psychologically. So this was our job. Like Jerry said, there was also a possibility that some of our POWs, and they were called the Peace Committee, were sympathizing with the NVA and the Viet Cong. If we, as Army intelligence debriefers, learned of any information, we were to take the basic information down and turn it over, in our case, to the U.S. Army Criminal Investigation Division Command, the criminal investigators to handle. That was not our job. Morris and I were sent to Fort Brooke, or Fort Sam Houston, Texas, Brooke Army Medical Center, where we were to meet our POW, in our case, Bob Lewis. As you heard from Joe Krecka and Dorothy, our POWs were first flown from Hanoi to Clark Air Force Base. Their teams of debriefers, Army counterintelligence agents, Naval Intelligence Service, Air Force Intelligence Service debriefers met our POWs at the hospitals, and as soon as the medical personnel cleared these guys, they were asked very simply who they knew, the names that were taken, as Joe told you. Every one of these POWs learned the names of as many POWs as they could and where they were. That was the job of the debriefers in Clark. Who did they know as POWs? Who died while in captivity, and who was left behind? At Brooke Army Medical Center, Chief Regis and I went to Bob Lewis's room. At Brooke, these guys were given individual rooms. They were not put in the wards. They were given individual rooms, clean sheets, lots of food. In these rooms is where we sat down with our POWs and debriefed them. We found that Bob was in pretty good shape. His only malady was malnutrition. We had our military topography maps with us so we could learn where Bob was when he was shot down and how he was marched into North Vietnam. On the first and second and third days, Bob would start out much like you and I would, at normal reading distance. And very quickly, Bob was squinting and getting very close to the map so he could see them. Lack of vitamins for his eyesight. He got better as we went along. We debriefed Bob, Morris and I debriefed Bob for 4 weeks. I went later, had to go back for another 2-week debriefing with Bob after Morris had been sent overseas on another assignment. Bob Lewis was a crew chief on a Huey, a Slick. He had a door gun, which he operated. They were in the Central Highlands on a mission to extract wounded soldiers during a combat operation. There was a C-47 above them who popped a parachute flare and silhouetted Bob's helicopter. The NVA were waiting for such a moment, and they took it. They shot Bob's helicopter out of the sky. He was shot down in the Central Highlands. His back was broken. Fortunately for Bob, he was put in the camp with the same camp that Dr. Kushner was in. Doc Kushner was the only medical doctor captured as a POW in the Vietnam War. Bob was in that camp. Doc Kushner showed him how to sleep in a hammock so that Bob's back would heal. Bob was marched into Cambodia and into North Vietnam. It took them a year to walk from the Central Highlands into Cambodia and up to North Vietnam. They marched around a little operation called Lam Son 719. How many of you guys remember that one? Bob was marched around that one by the NVA. They were put on trucks and sent to the Hoa Lo prison. Hoa Lo prison is known euphemistically as the Hanoi Hilton. By the way, if you look at the Google for Hanoi Hilton today, you'll find that the Hilton hotel system has a hotel in Hanoi called the Hanoi Hilton. Yeah, I found that ironic also. One of the interesting things that Bob told us about his treatment as a POW was that because Bob was black and a minority, he and the other minority enlisted prisoners were segregated somewhat from their white or Caucasian fellow POWs. They were given a little bit better food. They were given a little bit more food. They were, of course, told that they were fighting and dying the white man's war. If you'd been here earlier, you found that the racial ratios was quite skewed from what the rest of the world was led to believe as to who fought and who died. But Bob and his fellow minority prisoners ate the same amount of food as their Caucasian fellow POWs. They smuggled the other portions of their meals out the back door to their fellow POWs so they could share the food. There was a camaraderie among all POWs regardless of the NVA's attempt to segregate and get the minority prisoners to sympathize with the NVA and their cause. One of the things Bob told his captors was that as a Spec 4, he owned his own car, and he owned his own television set, and he slept in his own room in the barracks. You know, the North Vietnamese Army and the VC were so entrenched with their propaganda, they so believed their own propaganda, They didn't believe Bob. They thought Bob had been brainwashed into saying this. They did not believe Bob. Bob was repatriated to the United States during Operation Homecoming in 1973. As I said, we debriefed Bob for a total of 6 weeks in order to gain, as Jerry Van Ingen said, every bit of information we could from Bob. It was a very casual conversation. We sat around and we smoked, we joked. And I took a hell of a lot of notes, as did Morris. And then we went back to the office, and well into the night, we typed up our agent reports. 6 pages, or actually each page was 6 pages in triplicate, or in 6 pages duplicated with carbon paper. We didn't have internet. We didn't have computers back then, people. Computers, for me, were a brand new thing. Next slide, please. Frank Anton, then CW2, was Bob's pilot. Frank wrote a book after the war that talked to his captivity and march as a Caucasian into North Vietnam. I got that picture off the internet, but this is the book. Frank is quite bitter about his experience as a POW, as well he should be. One of the problems that Frank had was the pictures he later saw of himself being marched into North Vietnam. As Jerry talked about the Sang Tay raid, when Army Special Forces and Rangers tried to rescue the POWs. POW intelligence was so perishable. The moments had to be the perfect storm, if you will, in order for it to happen. Unfortunately, our successes during the war were never publicized. Unfortunately, military failures are well publicized by the press. Hence, the Sang Tay raid was well publicized about our failure to find the POWs. Bob's picture is on the last pictures in this book. I couldn't put her on screen because it's a very poor picture of Bob at a reunion, POW reunion later on. I just recently learned that Bob went on to serve over 20 years in the Army and retired as a master sergeant. I'm still trying to find Bob to this day. Thank you very much.
Even though Operation Homecoming was a wonderful, joyous time, as you remember, I told you there were still 2,400 plus MIAs at the end of the Vietnam War. Also, some of the things that the POWs learned when they came home was in some cases joyous, some cases surprise, and in some cases quite upsetting. Joe has given me permission to share this, but when he got back to Clark, I sat down and I said, Joe, we've got a little bad news. He said, well, what is it? And he said, the first thing is that your wife divorced you. And he goes, really? And he said, well, what's the other bad news? And he said, well, your father passed away. He said it took him about 45 days to get over the news of his wife divorcing him, and it took over 20 years to get over the fact that he lost his father while he was in captivity. One of the other things that was very hard, I'm not sure saying get over, but hard to handle, were those people that when they're watching their TVs and waiting for their phone calls, that their their loved ones were going to return found out that their loved ones weren't going to return. And so Lance would like to tell you about his story about watching those people come home and knowing after a while that their family wasn't going to get that phone call. So we'll bring back Lance.
Thank you, Jerry. I'm trying not to run late. I know you guys have been sitting here a long time, and you guys that have cushions on your chairs, would you bring one up? Put it in my, I appreciate it. I ended by saying that my mom, when she got to the bottom of the stairs, she said, just don't let him be, just let him be missing. What she was getting at there, the alternative was that he was killed. So many of our friends on base, other squadron mates and their families were going through the same thing we were going through, but a lot of them got the answer right away that he had been killed. So all around base, all week long, we saw staff cars going to houses and the kids being pulled out of school, and we never saw them again. So the DOD and the Air Force told us not to talk to anybody. Like you've heard in some of these presentations in the films. Don't talk to anybody, keep quiet. Don't give them any information, because the information you might give, they could use against my father. So we didn't want to do that. Kind of a scary thing to be told that at 10 years old when you're barely figuring out how to lie to your mom. And, you know, it really was a very tough time for us. And in the meantime, there's those unsavory people that think here's a perfect opportunity to take advantage of grieving people. I answered a phone call one day, and this is before cell phones and anything else, and I grabbed the phone and I said hello, and the guy on the other end wanted us to donate $5,000 so that he could buy farm equipment that he could take to Vietnam and trade for the release of my father. Does it say stupid on my forehead? My mom was so appalled. But the funny part about it was, guys like him, one of them in particular, Bo Greitz, ran for president of the United States a number of years ago. You remember that? Well, he was asking for $1 million. We laughed at him pretty quickly. You know, they didn't have social media and things like that we have today that make it a lot easier to find out what's going on in the world, let alone in our own neighborhood. In the 70s, if you're from Idaho, you might remember a guy named Marty Holtman. He was a weathercaster and newscaster at Channel 2. Well, Marty made available to us all the film propaganda reels that were brought to his station so that we could view them. So the Air Force would supply a staff car with it, drive us to Boise, and we would spend hours reviewing all those propaganda films that you saw on the nightly news. We looked them over because what were we looking for? My dad. 4 years after my dad was shot down, we were looking through one, and Mom picked my dad's backseater out of one of the films. And boy, I'm telling you what, that started a ball rolling that was pretty awesome. You know, we hadn't heard anything in 4 years. We figured if Gary made it out, Dad made it out as well. My mom during those years was pretty much missing in action otherwise. She traveled a lot. She was in Paris at the Accords. She was at the Geneva Convention. She went to Washington, D.C. so often I thought we were going to move there, which was not something I relished. I enjoyed being out mountain home after I got used to eating sagebrush and the soup. You know, it wasn't so bad. You know, she went wherever she could ask questions and get answers, as did all the wives. You know, the other pilots' wives, their families, their mothers, their fathers, brothers, sisters, and uncles, aunts. Everybody was asking for looking for answers, asking questions. In 1970, like these guys have already said, the National League of POW/MIA Families Incorporated. So we now had a voice, and we had a flag. We should have copy protected that so that we could be, you know, funded. Everybody thinks we're funded by the government. We're not. We're funded by private donations, and I'll get to something here in a little bit about how we do that. We moved to California in those days, but I didn't feel right about that because we felt safe on base. You could go anywhere. You could leave the first thing in the morning and come back at midnight. No one would have bothered you. No one would have questioned what you were doing. We were safe, and anybody in the military knows that. There were so many people there watching out for us. It was amazing. We moved to California for a very short time. Mom decided that that was not the place to be, the land of fruits and nuts. So we came back pretty quickly, but I learned a lot being in the civilian life. They had no clue what the military did. A lot of them, I'm just glad we didn't move anywhere near Berkeley, because who knows what would have happened. We stayed busy in those times, pretty much sending packages to Hanoi. Hopefully that they were getting delivered to my dad or to Gary, and his family was sending packages as well. We got most of them back, but a few stayed. So we were hopeful. At Mountain Home, if you don't know anything about the base out there, they had a elementary, junior high on the base, and to go to high school, you went into town. And I played football at that time, and always had to stay late for practice, always took the late bus home, was often stopped and harassed by the protesters standing out in front of the main gate. And they were pretty smart because they stayed far enough away where the security police wouldn't bother them. They were not on military property, so they could get away with pretty much anything. Well, it was getting pretty tiring. They were yelling at us, pointing their fingers, pounding on the bus, calling my dad, and our parents baby killers. One day, I'd pretty much had it. I was on the late bus. We got stopped again. So I asked the bus driver to open the door. I walked out. I found the biggest guy there. He's pointing his finger at me and yelling straight in my face. I hit him so hard, I think I killed his kids. What I didn't know at that time is when you hit somebody, it really hurts. And when the swelling went down on my hand, I had to answer to the military police, my mom, who patted me on the back and said, "I wish I'd have been there with you." But those years were tough. It was a roller coaster ride. We were getting information, then the information was pulled back. We were hearing things that were looking so good about the POWs coming home, and they'd be pulled out from under us. It's kind of hard to walk with your feet always spinning around the top of your head. But as you heard, the POWs came home in Operation Homecoming in 1973. And all but one token pilot were reclassified from missing in action to killed in action, body not recovered. So at that time, we had a funeral for my father, but all we put in the ground was a headstone. Dad's navigator, Captain Sigler, came to our house in Mountain Home within a few days after being returned to the States, and that's pretty good for a guy that just spent over 6 years in Hanoi Hilton, came to Mountain Home to talk to us. He wanted to tell my mom about what he knew about the circumstances of the crash. So I'm going to read something from a classified report written 2 days after the incident by the Air Force. And this information was not made available to us until 1986 under the Freedom of Information Act. And then I'm also going to read a part from Gary, his dad's backseater. Next slide, please. This is actually the report. You can see up there, you can barely read it, but it says May 2nd, 1967. These are unclassified documents. This first sheet right here is the actual airplane and everything it has to do with it. It gets the type of engines and the serial number on those engines. Why is that important? Because if they go into a crash site, what do they have to look for? The engines. So they had the serial numbers. That was all taken care of. Now this part I'm going to read verbatim. So next slide, please. This was written by the controllers there. My dad's call sign that night was Coach Flight. 1 RF-4C departed Udorn at 1357 Zulu, 29 April 1967. The aircraft commander was Major Mark Stevenson. My dad was promoted twice while he was missing in action. The pilot systems operator was Lieutenant Gary Sigler. Their target was a Hanoi highway bridge using IR sensors, LAS radar. I probably shouldn't move when you can't read at night. LAS radar and radio contact with them was through Brigham Control 13 minutes after takeoff, UDORN. The crew filed an I-35 NTE. 10 minutes after this time had elapsed, the dispatch officer at the 11th TRS Ops placed a phone call to Brigham, notified them that coach was overdue. At 16:20 Zulu, Brigham contacted Dogwood Flight. You don't suppose that's you, do you? Did you get a call on April 29, 1960? You couldn't. You had already been shot down. There you go. So a notified coach contacted Dogwood Flight and asked them to contact coach. Like I said, my dad's call sign that night was coach on UHF Guard channel. This resulted in negative contact. Dogwood's calls on guard were monitored by Hipster, another RF-4C. Hipster had previously attempted to contact coach over the target area to ask weather with no contact. After hearing Dogwood calling coach on guard, Hipster called hotel on HF and asked if they had any contact with coach during the evening. Motel replied negative contact. Pistol flight was launched to conduct a visual and electronic search for coach. Numerous calls on guard resulted in negative contact. Remember I said to remember the names that I pointed out? The guy that was leaning on the wing of that RF-4 in UDORN was Kaiser Flight. Kaiser Flight monitored all, I'm sorry, he was Pistol Flight. Kaiser Flight monitored all Pistol Flight's calls. Coach Flight's plan was to fly north at medium altitude, turn east and descend to 500 feet terrain clearance through the northwest mountains across the Red River and then turn southeast down the east side of Thud Ridge. How many of you ever heard of Thud Ridge? Thud is the sound an F-105 makes when it hits the ground. And pop to 1,000 feet over the target. They planned a left turn off the target to exit the valley on the southwest heading at minimum terrain clearance, then climb when clear of the SAM rings. There are 27 known SAM sites within 20 nautical miles radius of Coach's target. There were also heavily defended by AAA and numerous automatic weapons sites. Both Major Stevenson and Lieutenant Sigler carried 2 emergency radios, 38 caliber sidearms, day and night flares, and a survival chit, which is presumed both men were carrying because the chits were not in their personal effects. I'm going to show you one more slide, and then I'm going to read and tell you what Gary had to say. So next slide. This is actually where they went down. Right there. This was not known to us. This came back when my dad's remains were identified and we buried him. These were in his file. That's exactly where the plane went down. When he said that they needed to know everything. They knew everything. It just took a very long time to get that information. Okay, when Gary came to Mountain Home, right after he got back, he said they were outbound the target, the Hanoi Railroad Bridge, north of Hanoi, when they got indications that they were being tracked by radar. They immediately descended to treetop level, which there was between 200 and 300 feet. They were, their airspeed was about 500 knots. Midnight, they were both looking out of the aircraft for the telltale signs of a missile launch, which is a bright donut. If you don't see that bright donut, you don't see it. So you have to catch it when the first stages are fired. If you don't see that donut, you don't know there's a SAM missile coming at you. Whatever hit the plane slowed it dramatically. So he said they went from 500 knots to about 300 knots immediately. Gary thought they hit the trees on top of a ridge, the ridge that they were trying to get over to break radar contact. But he couldn't say for sure. Gary turned around to see what the damage was and immediately got engulfed at an explosion and fireball. He ejected immediately because he was on fire and got burned extensively. Over half of his body. It burned his flight suit off. He said that the whole incident, and this is what is amazing to me, took less than 10 seconds. 10 seconds. He came to a few times that night, but he couldn't move because of his injuries. He never saw my dad or a parachute. He felt that my father was still checking the plane over when it impacted the next ridge a few seconds later. He said that the smoke from the crash that he saw, he wasn't able to get to because he had been so badly injured. He was captured a day later by a 12-year-old kid with a rifle bigger than he was. Gary thought, okay, I can shoot this kid and get away. And then he thought, I can't move, I can't walk, I shoot a kid, their village finds out and they come up and they kill me. He gave his pistol to the kid. He was transferred to the Hanoi Hilton and spent over 6 years there. Although, you know, what Gary told us of the details, what he thought happened, it really wasn't until my dad's remains were repatriated in 1988 that we found out exactly what happened. We were told by the military to move on, get over it. They're never going to know what happened. Too many questions. They said no more information was available, and North Vietnam is saying there was no more information available as well. We felt that they did have information because they're meticulous record keepers, and we knew that it's just a matter of time before we get some of that information and find out what happened to my dad. We had delegations from the National League of Families in Vietnam on a regular basis, and they were starting to make headway as time went by, because the last thing you want to do, we were making headway because why were we there? We wanted to find out about the MIAs and the POWs, not about foreign policy. So they accepted us a lot easier, and we were able to bend their ear more about, you know, all we want to do is bring people home. So that we knew that would really make a difference in the long run. And the last thing we wanted to do is stand in front of them like our government was doing and calling them liars, because all they did is turn around and walk out of the room. Nobody wins in that case. We were there for humanitarian reasons only, not to judge, not to point a finger or demand anything. We wanted to demand. Every time I talked with those guys when they came back, they said it's so hard to keep your cool. During that time, things were pretty slow, had slowed down because the American people had forgotten. They were starting to forget and wanting to move on. But how can you forget and move on when you still have answers? We found out that in the 80s that a North Vietnamese coroner that had defected to the United States said he processed and stored over 400 U.S. remains in a warehouse in downtown Hanoi. We ramped up our pressure on Washington to get over there and find out if this was true or not. Numerous times we sent delegations over, our government started getting involved, and ultimately turned out that coroner didn't lie to us. During the next few years, remains were repatriated in small numbers, and identifications were made by SILHI. How many know what SILHI is? Central Identification Laboratory in Hawaii. I'm sorry for the slurring. I feel like I've got cotton severely planted in my nose. Which brings up something I wanted to let you know about also. You know, during this time, every branch of the service had its own, I'm not even sure what they call it, but mortuary services. Came to me. Each of them had their own. So they went out on to recover identifications, killed in action, looking for remains, everything, independently of each other. So we asked them, why didn't they combine all those efforts into one and do away with all that extra money being spent? And they went, wish we would have thought of that. So within a few years, they started SILHI. It is the national clearing for every branch of the service. All bodies recovered from every war, Korea, Vietnam, World War II, even World War I, go out to Hawaii for identification. We're in up in the north, or in Vietnam, the soil there is very acidic. And because of that, it's decomposing bone and artifacts at an accelerated rate. We're losing evidence in the soil by the day. Local people that may have had some information available no longer are alive. So when we go into these dig sites, and I'll be showing some pictures from that, we go into these dig sites, there's nobody around to tell us what happened. But we're still able to get them through, hopefully through stories and things, and we're able to find them. Through the Freedom of Information Act, we had requested any information that we could get about my dad's circumstance of loss. It wasn't going to go on because none of the items that you have seen today were given to us in that request. So everything I showed you early, none of that was available. It was classified. And not until he was buried did that information get released to us. On April 1988, we got a phone call from the DOD, and they had they told us that they had a tentative ID on my father, and her remains had been returned to the U.S. with a group of 23 other sets of remains. That was part of the 400 this coroner had talked about. My dad's remains were in storage in downtown Hanoi. I remember the call from my brother. I was standing up next to my answering machine listening to it, and I fell down, and I couldn't believe it. We tried to get hold of my mom, but she was out of the country. Because this happened to happen April 1988. My mom always celebrated and remembered my dad on April 29th every year by going to the Cayman Islands on vacation. So we had to wait till she got back to tell her. Quite a big deal. We all flew to Washington, D.C., and I'm getting to be done here. Sorry, Jerry, if I'm going long. We all flew to Washington, D.C. after a positive ID had been made. You can reject the ID that you get from the Department of Defense if you want to. If you don't believe that they have what they say they have, you can not take the identification as it stands. So we were in Washington because my brother and I took everything that they had and looked over it, and the way I put it, Helen Keller could see that this is our dad. So we accepted the identification and set a date for a full military burial in his hometown. I flew to Travis Air Force Base where a C-5 carrying my father's remains. I got to say something about that. My dad would have known he was coming back to the United States in a C-5. He would have never let this happen. He was a fighter pilot. That C-5 taxied right up to me, and there's a picture I have on the desk over here of me standing with my uncle and his wife as they unloaded my dad's remains after 21 years. I was charged with accompanying his remains to his final resting place in his hometown in Riverton, Utah. There were about 1,000 Air Force personnel standing. Excuse me. About 1,000 U.S. Air Force personnel standing behind me at attention. I was shaking uncontrollably. You can see that in the picture. I couldn't even put my hand over my heart. Have any of you seen the movie Taking Chance? That's exactly what happened for me. It's pretty much as I went through, except that I wasn't military. And in 1988, civilians didn't look on what was going on. They looked on it a little differently than they do now. At the cemetery, my dad was given full military burial with a missing man formation from 4 F-16s out of Hill Air Force Base. We put 24 POW bracelets on his casket that came from all over the world. Stars and Stripes magazine had written an article, Quiet Tiger was home. But as everything concluded and we were leaving, and everybody had left the cemetery, I remember driving out of the cemetery, and I turned over my shoulder, and there was my dad's casket up on a hill by himself. I didn't want to see that. So I turned around. I went back. I got my POW bracelet off his casket. I said, I'm not done. That was in 1988. My family and I did not stop our efforts to recover all the MIAs that we can. Like these guys said, 2,650 MIAs at the end of the war. Currently 1,627. We've done a pretty good job. My brother Mark, who couldn't be here because he's over in Pocatello doing a fundraiser for the National League. He's a vice chairman on the board of directors. My mom is on the board as well. I'm the Idaho State coordinator for the National League. And I'm proud of the support that we get from a very fine group of people here in the state of Idaho, Nevada, and Utah. I'd like to have them stand up. The Boise Valley POW MIA Corporation. You guys stand up and take a bow. The National League of Families was having financial trouble a number of years ago. And we reached out to these guys, and I was the director at that time. And I said, and they reached out to us and they said, what can you do to help keep us afloat? These guys stepped up, and the National League is going strong, and we have nobody to thank but them because of their efforts. And Elko, POWMIA, Pocatello, POWMIA Awareness Rally Association, and Logan, Utah, POWMIA. They've done great things for us, and I can't thank them enough. It would put the next picture up there. I'm sorry, leave that for a second. That's actually Dad's backseater, Gary Sigler, and my mom at the funeral. Gary's a great guy. I worked for him for 5 years after that. Found out a lot about my dad. The next picture, please. This is my brother, the top and the back, bald guy. These are POWMIA patches that he took with him that were in Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Vietnam, and in downtown Hanoi. And this is one of those patches. It's actually going to be replace this faded one I've got on my back. And next, this is actually on a dig site. These are the guys that go through meticulously looking at, you see in the back, the swing back there? That's where they put remains or any gravel, dirt, and they shake it down till they find something, hopefully. It's an amazing process. Let's go one more. This is a dig site. You can see how close proximity they are to houses now. You think that house was there when that plane crashed? No. They're developing that country in a way that, like talked about having a hotel at the Hanoi Hilton. They're building all over, and they're finding wreckages. And they find the wreckage, and they find remains, and they're really good about calling us. That's what this was. This particular site, they found remains from both the pilot. And on the other site, they found 2 as well. So This picture was taken in February of this year. He just got back a little while ago, and he's been busy ever since. So they have 4 remains, and Sil High is very busy. We feel pretty good the fact that the National League of Families has set a precedent for the World War II veterans' families and the Korea War veterans' families, because we were told by the Department of Defense that if it wasn't for the efforts of the National League keeping that aspect of our wars alive, those people would not have a voice today. So we're awfully proud of the work that we did, because I turned around. Thank you.
We do have time for some questions, and Sue is going to go with the roving mic and raise your hand if you have a question.
I just want to say one thing first. I was very honored to go with Lance in the very first group of honor flight World War II men and women that we took to Washington, D.C. And in addition to going to the World War II museum, thank you, Memorial. It's spectacular. It's so awesome. We also went to the Korean and the Vietnam Wall, the Korean Memorial and the Vietnam Wall. And when we were there were about 40 of us walking down by the wall, which most people hadn't seen yet. Lance very quietly walked over to the wall, and he put his finger on his dad's name. And it was incredible. So, okay, question time. So, yes. And you can ask questions of anyone at the table, by the way, not just of me or Jerry. Excuse me.
I'm trying to get a little bit more information about that period. Last year, there was additional information that was released, basically Nixon's tapes and additional information about Johnson. And what I've been reading is that in 1968, when Johnson had declared that he was not going to run for office again, and that there was peace talks in Paris at that time, and that Nixon scuttled these talks to get reelected. My question to anyone here is there any truth in that?
Joe, you want to comment to that?
How do you spell horse crap? Yeah, the war lasted from 68 then to 73. The first thing I knew about Paris peace talks was in 1972. I didn't know about any peace talks in 1968. And there's all kinds of stuff that floats around on the internet and even the TV news, and a lot of it is, I'm not trying to disparage what you're saying. If you want to believe that, you go right ahead and believe it. But I think it's rubbish.
Yeah, it's not Joe's experience, obviously.
There's
question?
A lot of as everyone knows, everything is on the internet is true. But what you really heard today is true. These people this is firsthand information, and that's always the best. Do we have any other questions?
Any more questions here? You'd like to ask?
In the back.
Yes, back here. Okay.
Question for Joe. Everybody looks so well groomed getting on the buses, even in Hanoi. I'm just wondering about personal hygiene. Did you cut each other's hair? Did they cut it for you? What were conditions like?
In 1972, we were up, my group of 208 POWs was in a camp called Dog Patch on the Chinese border. The SRO did not appreciate us wanting to call him Mamayokum. But they started feeding us larger quantities of, actually it was beefalo, and they started fattening us up. And then just before we came home, they gave us haircuts and shaves and gave us all these nice-looking, you know, as opposed to our POW togs, which I forgot to bring with me today. They gave us a blue shirt and blue pants and black shoes and a nice jacket. So we looked fairly presentable. Is that what you're talking about? Yeah. So we looked okay. And that one photo of Thanksgiving 1968, where we were chopping turkeys' heads off and stuff like that, I was down to about 125 pounds. Just before we came home, and they weighed us when we got to Clark, I was 155 pounds. So I gained 30 pounds in those few months approaching getting repatriated. So that's, I mean, the communists didn't want us to look like skeletons like the guys did in World War II. They fattened us up.
And so, Joe, someone asked me earlier, how were those photos taken of you all in the prisoner of war camp in Hanoi Hilton?
The photos that you saw there, those black and white photos, came from Department of Defense, DOD photos that were sent to me. Like there were about 20 photos, and I think that the DOD got them from those Japanese journalists that happened to be taking pictures at that time. They were probably somewhere in the what do they call it, the public domain.
Any other questions?
Yeah, we have a question about Dawn with the POW bracelet you always wear on your arm.
What I have here is a POW bracelet. I met Cardine McMurray when he was repatriated with Bob at Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio, Texas. Cardine was also well cared for because he was also black. I will tell you a funny story. We almost did to Bob and Cardine one night in San Antonio what the NVA couldn't do in 5 years. We could not buy a drink in San Antonio as soon as those guys were identified as POWs. Boy, did we get our butts chewed the next morning by the chief nurse.
Any other questions out here? Yes, sir.
I was just wondering how you could get more information on POWs, MIAs. I've got a buddy that's still over there someplace.
The Department of Defense is your best bet. There's a casualty resolution office at the Department of Defense. That's the only way to go because that information is not available just to anybody. They cannot release it to you unless the family pre-approves that. Any information, like if you get on the internet and look up the virtual wall, unless the family approved that information going in public, you wouldn't see it. So you have to start with the family if you can. And there's a way to find out. You can just tape their, like if you typed my dad's name in, you'll find out everything about me you need to know. My bank account, shoe size. But we had to approve that. So that information just isn't available. If you have a buddy that isn't, you have to contact the family or the Department of Defense and see if they'll release it to you. It's a tough job. It's not easy. You know the way how security is these days.
Good question, yeah. Anyone else here? Yes.
In the 80s and 90s, there were a lot of so-called confirmed sightings of American POWs working on road crews and slave labor in factories and stuff. Can you elaborate on that, or is that just all hype, or what?
Why don't you both answer? Yeah.
This is a beauty. Every single time that one of those sightings has happened, it's always been disproven. There was one photo of 3 guys, and one of them was holding a sign that said February the 7th, 1971, and it took 18 months, but the DIA proved that those were political prisoners in Russia, even though one snake oil salesman, and I'm trying to think of his name, Anyways, he was a high-priced lawyer that made millions and millions of bucks. That said, that's my dad, Richardson, and Albro, something Albro the Third, and then later it was proven that it wasn't. It was a complete hoax, and I was a memory bank for names. At one time, I had 354 names memorized, and when I came home, I gave all those names to one of the debriefers like Don, and every single name that I had on my list was the name of somebody that came home.
Go ahead. You're just going to add to that? No, okay. All right, there's also so much information out about the POWs that were left behind. We can't disprove that. They've checked, we've done those select committees, government select committees for years. We go back to square one looking to see if there's any credible information. Well, there was. There were known live POWs on the ground when we left. Do you think they're still alive? Would you want them to still be alive? I think that our government pulled a fast one on us. We know that my dad wasn't one of those. I'm glad. I'm glad he was killed instantly. Didn't have to think about what was happening. But to those families that we find that, and I'm assuming that we're going to find out, they may have left live POWs over there for a bargain. The Vietnamese North Vietnam was going to use those as bargaining chips to get the money that we promised them. We promised them $3 billion. You know how much we gave them? They said in a book that they had saved some some U.S. pilots back to use as a bargaining chip. That's me talking. We read it all. We put it in front of a select committee. They said there's no credible evidence to say that. Well, then why did the Vietnamese put it in their books? It's on their record. So if that ever comes to pass, who are we going to hold accountable for that? By bringing this stuff up, I had a guy hand me a handful of dog tags. What do you want me to do with those? We can't do anything about that. We can go over there and tell them to give us these guys back. They said, we don't have them. You just have a bunch of dog tags. I can buy a $20 dog tag machine myself. Make as many as I want, especially if there's money involved. So we got to remember that. Half of this stuff is people that they have a dream that their loved one is still alive, being held in a POW camp somewhere in Indochina right now. Would you want him back after this long? I mean, that's a sad thing to say. That breaks my heart to say. But those guys didn't deserve being held that long. And I hope for their benefit, they didn't have to. So keep that in mind when you're reading stuff on the internet. Not everything you read is the truth. And you are not going to be the guy that turns this thing around. If you're looking for a smoking gun, get involved. You won't get involved in Nampa, Idaho, or Boise, Idaho. You can get involved in Washington, D.C. You better know what you're talking about because they will tear you apart. I've seen it. Thanks.
I can also add to that a little bit in that in my search and studies for this, I came up with some pretty, I think, distressing information, and that is that there was 2.7 million military personnel that served in Vietnam. In the 2010 census, which asked if you were a Vietnam veteran, 9,800,000 people claimed that they were veterans in the Vietnam War. So I guess that's an example of the misinformation that is out there and has run rampant. There's also numerous sightings that have been tracked down by the government and found to be totally bogus. So they're constantly, I will say that from the evidence I've seen, the government takes these sightings seriously and tries to get information and goes after any sighting or any evidence, any dog tags but first thing they do is authenticate. And most of this stuff is bogus, unfortunately.
Yeah, I want to know if you. I want to know if the bargaining chip, so to speak, is what's going on with the 4 guys in Iran.
You mean on the
Well,
on
I
the
know,
nuclear?
but he said that they were used as later bargaining chips. I'm wondering if that would be a similar situation.
We can't get into the current war because we just don't have the time. Yeah, this is really
I think-
about Vietnam.
I think it's 1 o'clock, so that's the if you
We
have any
one,
other.
one more question. Where? Who? Okay, thank you.
It's not a question. It's a thank you, Warhawk. Thank you, people who shared, and thank you, vets.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, and that ends our presentation. I hope you enjoyed it, and come back next month.